to Misfits and Motorcycles.
We are the Misses.
Exactly. Here at the Recycle Garage.
In sunny Santa Cruz, California.
Exactly. So if you don't know us, we host the Motorcycles and Misfits podcast. Check it out. But we're here to share some stuff with you. In this series, we're going to be talking about mechanical issues, answering questions.
I mean, hopefully, over the course of the series, we're going to cover everything to do with motorcycles. We're going to cover engine systems, carburation and fuel injection, braking systems, tyres. There's a world of knowledge out there. You can bore your relatives at the Thanksgiving table mightily with the things that we're going to share right now. And today...
But we got something special.
We have.
I think this is a bit of a mystery that many people may not even think about, but I have. Emma, what do you have here?
Well, for those that know me, I do a lot of work with vintage bikes. And what we have today is we have a humble shock absorber from a 1963 Honda Dream. And I know you've got questions before we even get any further.
I do. This doesn't look like any shock I've ever seen. So my first question is, why is it square?
That is an absolutely fantastic question. And truthfully, I'm not sure I have the definitive answer. I would love to have been part of the meeting in the boardroom in the early 60s when an engineer suggested to Soichiro Honda himself, probably after drinking sake all night, we're going to put square shock absorbers on our bike. There's absolutely no reason for it at all aside from styling. And back in the early 60s, it was a time when a lot of manufacturers were taking pretty bold steps with styling, even in England. Full bodywork, really quite radical bodywork, was experimented a lot. And a Honda Dream, there's a lot of angles on this bike, so the actual shocks dovetail into it. But I like this shock for a number of reasons. The first being, it's square!
It's square. It reminds me of the 80s, like my hair.
Like your hair. It reminds me of a delicious bottle of gin. But then a lot reminds me of gin. The reason I picked this shock, not least because it is quite interesting, there's nothing you can see from the outside that gives us a clue of what's going on inside. So what I did, I broke one down for you. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each component and we'll start at the top and work our way down. We'll bring them out and we'll talk about each component. The first component, this is the mounting, and this would actually mount on the frame of the bike. You can see that it's rubber mounted, and I know you've got questions. Why is it rubber mounted?
Vibrations?
It's certainly part of it, but go back to your physics lessons when you were in school. That was a long time ago. But if we consider that as the suspension of the bike moves up, the shock is actually going to twist like that. And the easiest way, we're not talking about a great deal of movement, just a couple of millimeters, but the easiest way to accommodate that is if we put a rubber bushing in. Yes, it absorbs vibration, but it'll give you some degree of movement.
Did they come up with that at the same board meeting with the sake?
I'm sure. Let's move down. This is the cover. Purely cosmetic, yes?
I think I saw something like this on a bottle of perfume.
Chanel number 5. It's actually not just cosmetic. Yeah, it's color-coded to the bike. These bikes came in white, red, blue and black. But it serves quite a vital purpose. It actually keeps road grime out of the shock absorber itself.
All right, and I'm actually surprised that this is plastic.
Yeah, the Japanese manufacturers were always willing to save a few pounds, which meant performance. The less your bike weighs, the faster it's going to go. And you say, well, you know, surely making this out of plastic and not metal, it's not going to save that much weight. And that's largely true. But when you multiply that over hundreds of components of the bike, you can actually make a lighter weight bike. So yeah, it's cosmetic, but it served a purpose as well. The bike, back in the early 60s, this bike was designed to be ridden on paved roads, and in some countries where the roads aren't quite so developed, on roads that are dirt. Now, riding a Honda Dream on a dirt road would have been all kinds of terrifying.
Not a
but
dream.
At least this is going to stop the dirt from getting inside your shock. Moving down, this is its mate for the bottom half. And again, its purpose is to keep dirt out of the shock itself. Now we're getting into the meaty stuff.
Yeah.
This is the spring.
Okay.
And this actually lives inside. Now, you'll notice the spring is round.
Yes.
Making a square spring, that would be a little tough. But what I want you to notice about this spring is if you look at the way it's wound, the coils are quite far apart here and quite close together here. Now that's called a progressive spring, and it's really quite advanced for the time. The idea being is as the shock compresses, it's really quite soft as it begins, and it gives you a nice plush ride. As it compresses further, you're getting more into the tighter coil springs, so it becomes harder. So the idea is it's very soft at the beginning of the travel, and as it gets towards the end of its travel, it gets progressively harder. So you can have a nice squashy ride without it bottoming out. This is the main body of the shock, and that extends up inside. Now this is going to serve as a carrier for the damping mechanism, which is where the real interesting meaty stuff is.
That's what I was curious about. Because without that, you're just going to be bouncing down the road.
Right. You have to have a damping mechanism. And what damping does is it slows everything down. And in this case, as with every other shock absorber on the market, you slow down the movement with oil.
I think I have one of these on my screen door.
You do.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same principle. And we can break this down further, and we can pull out the top and pull out the plunger and actually look at some of the components that we have in here. We have the cylinder, the piston and damper rod. We have the stop spring, and then we have the actual body of the top of the damping mechanism. And each of these plays a very significant role on how this shock absorber works. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosely assemble it, and I'm going to explain exactly what happens. The piston goes in first, the stop spring goes in, and then the body top goes in. Now if we have a look at the piston itself, we can see that there are small holes in the piston, and the function of those holes is for oil to go through. But because the holes are very, very small, the oil can't flow freely. It moves through slowly. So as the shock absorber moves up and down, the oil is slowing down the movement.
Hold on. Do that again.
Are you enjoying that, darling? I particularly like the noise.
Okay, but how does it all work together?
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to loosely assemble it, and it's all going to make some kind of sense, I hope. So the damping mechanism goes in the body, and this is where there'd be oil. The entire assembly would be filled with shock absorber oil. And so when it's got oil in it, this movement becomes firm, compression, firm, rebound.
And this is the same thing that's happening on the front shocks, isn't it?
Exactly the same principle. The front forks of your bike work on the same principle, just on a larger scale. You have a spring which basically takes the load. Then you have a damping mechanism which will damp in that direction, because you don't want the bike to slam down, and then you certainly don't want it to slam back up. So the oil moving through small passageways and slowing the whole thing down is what gives you the damping mechanism. We'll pull this out again, and if we consider the spring, this spring serves quite an important purpose. And the purpose is, as the shock comes back up to its fullest extent, rather than slamming against the top and giving you a hard, jarring ride, it has a spring that just slows down that last bit of movement as it reaches the top.
So, this is a very old shock. It doesn't look like anything I've seen.
Exactly. This is a very antiquated shock. So let's get into something a little more modern.
How about that?
Now, if your bike's from the 70s or the 80s or even the 90s, you're going to have something that looks like this.
This is still from a dual shock bike.
It is from a dual shock bike.
We don't have many of those anymore.
Yeah, a lot of the retro bikes still have dual shocks on them. But this is a great example of what you're going to see. But you can see the principles are the same. We have the mounting points, top and bottom, again with the rubber mounts. We have the body itself, and the damping mechanism is within the body. We have the damping rod right there. So all the damping is happening inside the body. And then we have the spring, and the shield to keep the dirt out has really become more of a styling exercise than any function now.
So that's a basic shock, but things are a little more modern now.
Hang on, because we're not quite done with this. What we've done on this shock is, instead of having a progressive spring, now you have an adjustment. And you can go from the softest setting, which allows the spring to be at its greatest length, to the firmest setting, which basically compresses the spring. And that's a good substitute for having a progressive spring.
But I have another one to show you.
I know. All right, so we have just jumped 10 years in development from the last one. This is a Monoshock. Now this particular one is off a dirt bike. However, the design and function is exactly the same as on a super bike you can buy now. The reason manufacturers have gone to this design is because of the design of the subframe of the bike and the swing arm itself. It's a lot more rigid, which makes for better handling. So now we have moved from the rubber bushings, now we are in proper articulated rose joints. They give you the twisting movement, and you have some lateral movement as well, which will account for any side-to-side movement. The damper rod is a huge amount larger than in our little shock. It has to do more than twice the work. Here's the damper body, and we can see that it's actually threaded. Why is it threaded? We can actually adjust the tension of the spring using this collar. And the range of adjustment has gone from none to just 5 to infinite. From here to the end of the thread, we can adjust that spring to account for rider weight, for terrain,
luggage,
for weight of the bike, for luggage of the bike.
All right, I have a question.
Yes.
Saw that one coming? What is this?
Okay, we're going to come to this. So this is a nitrogen cartridge. Nitrogen is used extensively in shock absorbers because it assists with distribution of the oil in the body. The most efficient way of getting oil around the passages inside a shock is by using compressed air and oil together. Air itself, when a shock moves up and down, air gets quite warm. Nitrogen, because it is an inert gas, it stays cooler longer. And by adding extra volume, you can mitigate the temperature even more. It also gives you a useful range of adjustment. This might be tucked away underneath the bike, and so adjustments aren't easy to get to. This you can put somewhere where it's easy to get.
Ah, right, because this is in the center of the bike.
Right, this may be clamped on the side of the frame, and you can add air or nitrogen there. You know what, if you add a little bit of air, it's not going to do you any harm. There's also an adjustment here which will allow movement of a piston in here to slow the process down further, which really goes back to the same damping that this has got. As the shock compresses, oil and air is travelling through the body, through the line, into this, which is really a secondary damper body.
All right, I just have one more question for you.
Ask away, dear.
I've heard that because these are sealed, they can't be rebuilt. Is that true?
That is largely true, and the reason I'm using this as an example, these shocks, when they blow out, as these have done, really you should just throw them away. Now, back in the 60s when that happened was no problem. You could toddle off down to the Honda dealer and buy yourself a new pair of shocks, put them on and get yourself down the road. These shocks have been unavailable now for 30, 40 years. So we have to get a little bit more creative. So what I'm doing, I'm rebuilding these for a client. I've sourced the oil seals, I've sourced the components I need to rebuild them, and I'm basically going to rebuild these. Strictly speaking, you should never have to. It's only because they're such a vintage bike.
Well, there you go. Now we know what's in there and you've solved the mystery.
It's one of those things, it's deceptively simple. All you've got to remember is the spring is supporting your weight. Everything else slows that movement down, so you're not bouncing down the road like Tigger. And that's it. It's as simple as that.
There you go. And if you want to learn even more about all things motorcycles, check out Motorcycles and Misfits podcast, where we talk at length about these things. And Emma, thank you very much for sharing this, especially your knowledge. You are an invaluable resource.
Thank you. That's
You're
very
welcome.
kind of you, and I'm happy to share it. I've been messing around with these things for 41 years. If I can pass on some of that knowledge to people, I'm thrilled to do so.
So to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, don't forget to link and subscribe to Misfits and Motorcycles. I think we got another one in the can. What do you think?
I think so. Boom!